The polished marble floor of Apex Prestige Motors reflected the blinding halogen lights, like ice. But the atmosphere inside turned freezing the moment Wesley Vance walked through the glass doors. He wore a faded canvas work jacket, dark denim stained with machine oil, and heavy leather boots. Tight in his right hand, he held the fingers of his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. She wore a brightly colored knit sweater missing its top button, her eyes wide as she stared at the gleaming machines lining the showroom floor. To the elite clientele browsing the displays, Wesley looked entirely out of place, an unwelcome smudge on perfect luxury. General Manager Preston Blake noticed them immediately. Adjusting his gold cufflinks, his face tightened into an expression of profound irritation as he marched across the floor. He stood in front of Wesley, blocking his path to a deep blue family SUV, and spoke in a voice sharp enough to cut. "Sir, I must ask you to step outside," Preston said, his tone carrying a practiced, venomous courtesy. "Our clientele expects a certain environment when making these kinds of investments. We don't accommodate loitering, and frankly, the vehicles on this floor start at a price point that requires an entirely different demographic." Wesley didn't flinch. He possessed the quiet, grounded masculinity of a man who had faced far worse things than an arrogant manager. For the past 3 years since his wife Clara had passed away, Wesley had lived without vanity. He worked grueling hours as an aircraft mechanic at a secluded private airfield on the outskirts of Silver Ridge, pouring every ounce of his energy into making sure Chloe felt safe and loved. He had spent 24 months saving every dollar to ensure he could walk into this building today. "I am not loitering," Wesley replied calmly, his deep voice steady in the quiet room. "I am here to purchase a reliable, safe vehicle for my daughter. I have the means, and I am ready to close the deal today." Preston let out a short, dismissive laugh, looking past Wesley toward the massive glass windows. Outside sat Wesley's truck, a battered 1,998 dark green Dodge Ram 1500 that local mechanics called the Anvil. The driver's side door was a slightly different shade of green from an old scrapyard replacement. The rear bumper was dented, and the passenger mirror was secured with thick wire. It was an eyesore in a lot filled with German engineering. Preston pointed a manicured finger toward the window. "You see that machine out there, sir? That belongs in a junkyard, not outside my showroom. If you are looking for a cheap, pre-owned sedan, there is a low-end lot 15 miles down the interstate. This place is not for you. Please leave before I have security escort you out." A few customers nearby murmured, while a younger man quietly recorded the confrontation on his smartphone. Chloe pulled closer to her father's leg, her chin trembling as she looked up at the angry man in the suit. She gripped Wesley's hand tighter, her small voice whispering, "Daddy, can we go home? The ocean blue car is too mean." Wesley felt a fierce, protective ache tighten in his chest. Seeing the light dim in his daughter's eyes was a boundary no man was allowed to cross. He knelt down, adjusting her backpack, completely ignoring the manager standing over him. "Hey, look at me, sweet girl," Wesley said softly, his voice blocking out the hostility of the room. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. We worked hard for this, remember? We did it together." He stood back up, his eyes locking onto Preston with a cold intensity that made the manager instinctively step back. Wesley turned, keeping himself between his daughter and the staring crowd, and began walking toward the glass exit. He was prepared to take his business elsewhere, to find safety for his child, without sacrificing his dignity. But they were only 3 feet from the threshold when a sudden screech of high-end brakes echoed through the parking lot. A massive, armored black executive sedan tore into the driveway, stopping directly behind Wesley's battered green truck. The rear door flew open, and a woman stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Catherine Sterling was 36, a legendary figure in the corporate world, and the CEO of the Sterling Luxury Network. Dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, she was ruthless in negotiations and entirely unyielding under pressure, a queen of an empire who rarely visited individual dealerships. She took 2 steps toward the entrance when her eyes caught the dented green tailgate of the 1998 Dodge Ram. Catherine froze. Every muscle in her body locked tight. The cold mask she wore for the business world shattered in an instant, her face draining of all color until she looked ghost white. Her breathing turned shallow, her hand trembling as she stared at the weathered green metal. 8 years ago, during a brutal blizzard on Pass 82, that exact truck had bypassed a military blockade. The man inside had pulled her dying body from a crushed, burning sports car seconds before an explosion. She had spent a decade using her billions to find him, only to hit dead ends. Inside, Preston Blake saw his billionaire boss standing frozen. Desperate to impress her, he hurried toward the doors, sneering at Wesley. "Watch your step, regular," Preston hissed, trying to push past. "The owner of this entire empire just arrived, and she doesn't like looking at garbage." The glass doors slid open. Catherine stepped into the silent lobby, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk until they landed squarely on the man in the faded canvas jacket holding a little girl's hand. The room held its breath as the billionaire CEO walked directly toward them, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. The silence in the showroom was so absolute that the hum of the overhead climate control sounded like a distant engine. Catherine Sterling stopped exactly 4 feet away from Wesley, her gaze locked onto his weathered face. She looked at the sharp line of his jaw, the faint scar just below his left ear, and the steady, unblinking gray eyes that had haunted her nightmares and her hopes for nearly a decade. The cold, intimidating executive who kept Fortune 500 boards in a state of constant anxiety seemed to vanish, replaced by a woman fighting to draw a breath. "Are you Wesley?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly, a sound so rare her personal security team outside glanced at each other in immediate alertness. "Wesley Vance?" Wesley shifted his weight, his large hand remaining firmly over Chloe's shoulder. He looked at the woman in the charcoal blazer. He remembered the smell of burning premium leather, the terrifying screech of metal tearing against frozen rock on Pass 82, and the desperate, frantic pulse he had held against his thumb while the winter wind threatened to swallow them both. He remembered her face, though it had been covered in soot and blood the last time he saw it. "I am," Wesley said quietly. A tremor passed through Catherine's hands, and she quickly clasped them in front of her to hide the shaking. It was a subtle gesture, but to anyone watching closely, it was clear that the foundation of the room had just completely overturned. Preston Blake, entirely misreading the emotional current rushing through the air, stepped forward with an eager, obsequious smile. "Miss Sterling, please accept my sincerest apologies for this disruption," Preston said, casting a sharp, warning glare at Wesley. "This man and his child slipped past our front reception. I was just in the process of removing them and their vehicle from the premises. We don't allow individuals of this caliber to compromise the integrity of our flagship location." Catherine did not look at Preston. She didn't even blink. Her eyes remained anchored to Wesley, taking in the grease-stained canvas jacket and the heavy, practical work boots. "What did you say to him, Preston?" she asked. Her voice hadn't risen in volume, but it had dropped into a terrifying, icy register that caused the general manager's smile to instantly freeze. I simply informed the gentleman of our standard pricing structure, Miss Sterling," Preston stammered, a sudden bead of sweat forming at his hairline. "I pointed out that our inventory starts at $85,000, which is far beyond the standard budget for someone driving a vehicle like the one out there. I was protecting the brand." "Protecting the brand," Catherine repeated. She turned her head slowly, her cold, calculating eyes fixing onto Preston with the weight of a hydraulic press. "You believe the Sterling brand is built on insulting customers? You believe your job description includes measuring a man's worth by the rust on his fender?" The young man with the smartphone moved slightly closer, ensuring his camera captured every inch of Preston's rapidly pale face. The rest of the sales staff had moved to the perimeter of the floor, standing perfectly rigid, terrified to draw the billionaire's attention. Chloe looked up at Catherine, her initial fear giving way to a child's profound curiosity. She noticed that the powerful woman's hands were still vibrating slightly. She reached up and tugged on Wesley's jacket. "Daddy, is the sharp lady okay? She looks like she's about to cry, but she's trying to be a grown-up about it." The comment hit the room like a physical blow. Catherine's gaze dropped to Chloe. The little girl's eyes were the exact shade of the summer sky, clear and completely without guile, mirroring the honesty of the man standing beside her. Catherine felt a sudden, sharp ache in her throat. For a woman who spent every hour of her life surrounded by corporate sycophants and calculated contracts, this child's raw observation felt incredibly heavy. "I am okay, sweetie," Catherine said softly, her tone shifting so drastically from her corporate voice that Preston actually gasped. "I'm just remembering something very important." She looked back up at Wesley. 10 years I've been looking for you. The address you wrote on that piece of paper in the emergency room, it belonged to a boarding house near the naval base. By the time I was discharged from the trauma unit, you had vanished. The Navy Records Department told me your unit details were restricted. I hired 3 private intelligence firms, Wesley. They found nothing. I transferred to the private sector shortly after that winter, Wesley replied, his voice a calm, grounding contrast to her intense urgency. My wife became ill. The military required me to be on deployment cycles that didn't allow me to stay in one place. I took a position maintaining private corporate aircraft at Silver Ridge Airfield. I needed to be home every night. Catherine absorbed the information, her mind instantly filling in the gaps. A former elite naval aviation specialist, a man whose skills were legendary, working in a quiet hangar just to ensure he could sit at a kitchen table with his family. And your wife? Catherine asked quietly, though she already knew the answer from the heavy, reverent way he spoke in the past tense. She passed 3 years ago, Wesley said, his hand giving Chloe's shoulder a gentle, reassuring squeeze. It's just been the 2 of us since then. Catherine looked at the man who had given up the sky, given up the prestige of his specialized military rank, and walked away from everything to become an anchor for his child. He had saved her life without asking for a single dime, and then he had quietly gone back to the shadows to fight a personal war against grief, entirely unnoticed by the world that judged him by his boots. She turned back to Preston Blake. Her face was completely devoid of emotion, now the absolute mask of a CEO about to eliminate a liability. Preston, she said, her voice echoing off the high glass ceilings, you are relieved of your duties at Apex Prestige Motors, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the property. Your personal belongings will be couriered to your home address by tomorrow afternoon. Preston's jaw dropped. Miss Sterling, please. I've given 6 years to this dealership. I was only trying to maintain the standards you set for the luxury network. You don't understand my standards, Catherine interrupted, her voice cutting him off like a blade. And you never will. Get out of my sight. 2 large men in black suits stepped out from behind the executive sedan outside, entered the showroom, and firmly took Preston by the arms. The former manager did not look back as he was marched through the doors, his expensive leather shoes clicking clumsily against the stone. Catherine turned her full attention back to Wesley, the coldness leaving her eyes once more. She stepped closer, ignoring the murmuring crowd that had gathered near the display models. Wesley, you came here to buy a car for your daughter, she said. I want you to take any vehicle on this floor. The armored flagship, the premium touring models, anything. It's yours. It isn't a gift, and it isn't a negotiation. It is a fraction of what I owe you. Wesley looked at the glistening row of luxury SUVs, then down at his daughter's worn sweater, and finally back at the billionaire CEO. His expression didn't change. There was no sudden excitement, no greed, no relief. Just the steady, unyielding pride of a man who earned his own way. I didn't come here for a handout, Miss Sterling, Wesley said firmly. I have $62,000 in certified bank drafts in my pocket. I intend to pay for my vehicle myself. Catherine Sterling stared at the stack of certified bank drafts in Wesley's calloused hand. The paper was crisp, but the edges were slightly worn, as if they had been pulled out and checked multiple times late at night. $62,000. To the investors she dealt with daily, that sum was a rounding error on a quarterly spreadsheet. But looking at the grease beneath Wesley's fingernails and the faded fabric of his daughter's sweater, Catherine knew exactly what those numbers represented. They represented hundreds of sleepless nights, skipped meals, and a relentless, quiet discipline driven entirely by a father's love. The surrounding crowd of wealthy patrons had completely stopped pretending to look at brochures. They watched in absolute silence, captivated by the sudden reversal of power. The air in the showroom had shifted from toxic arrogance to heavy, breathless anticipation. Meredith Cole, a senior sales consultant who had spent the last 10 years being overlooked by Preston Blake, stepped forward cautiously. Her hands were folded politely, her demeanor a stark contrast to her former manager's malice. Miss Sterling, if I may, Meredith said quietly, her voice full of genuine respect. I can personally oversee the transaction for Mr. Vance. We have a midnight Sapphire Horizon SUV in the back holding bay. It has the exact advanced safety cell and reinforced steel chassis he was inquiring about. Catherine didn't break eye contact with Wesley. Her voice was soft, stripped entirely of its executive armor. You won't pay full price, Wesley. If your pride won't allow me to give you the vehicle, then you will allow me to apply the maximum manufacturer discount. It is my showroom. I set the margins. Wesley looked at Catherine for a long moment, measuring her intent. He recognized the sincerity in her eyes, a rare quality in a place built on superficial flash. He nodded once, a slow, dignified acceptance. "Thank you," he said simply. Meredith immediately moved toward the glass partition to pull the paperwork, her face glowing with a sense of justice that had long been absent from the dealership. While the administrative details were being arranged, Chloe's small fingers slipped from Wesley's grip. Drawn by the sheer majesty of the vehicle Meredith had mentioned, she walked toward a display model of the Midnight Sapphire SUV. The paint was deep and lustrous, catching the light like a dark ocean under a clear sky. Chloe pressed her tiny hands against the polished driver's side door, leaving two perfect, fogged smudges. "Look, Daddy," Chloe called out, her voice echoing beautifully in the cavernous room. "It has the little sensors on the mirrors, the ones Mommy said would keep us from ever bumping into things when the fog rolls into the valley. She told me before she went to the hospital that one day you'd find a car that could watch over us when you were tired." Wesley froze. A visible shadow of memory passed over his features, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his emotions completely locked away. He walked over to his daughter, kneeling beside her on the cold marble floor. He didn't care that dozens of wealthy eyes were tracking his every move. He reached out and gently wiped the smudges she had made on the door, his large, rough hand looking incredibly heavy against the flawless paint. "She was right, sweet girl," Wesley whispered, his voice thick but steady. "It's got everything we need to stay safe on the Ridge Road." Catherine followed them, standing a few feet away. Hearing the child speak of her late mother with such innocent clarity struck a chord deep inside her. Catherine had wealth that could purchase entire city blocks, yet she lived in a quiet, empty penthouse where the only sound was the hum of the city below. She had everything the world deemed valuable, but looking at this broken family standing together in the light of the showroom, she realized she had absolutely no peace. Wesley stood up, his eyes scanning the vehicle's front assembly. His gaze lingered on the stacked between the hood and the front quarter panel. Without a word, he reached down, tracing the seam with the tip of his thumb. His movements were instantly different, no longer the casual inspection of a buyer, but the precise, analytical touch of a master technician. "This model has the variable geometry thermal cooling vents," Wesley murmured, almost to himself. "But the actuator linkage on this specific display batch is set too close to the primary exhaust manifold. In extreme summer heat, the expansion rate of the alloy will cause the vents to seize open." Catherine's eyebrows shot up. She knew the technical specifications of her entire fleet, but the detail Wesley had just casually remarked upon was a restricted engineering notation that had only been flagged by the European design team 3 weeks prior in a private corporate memo. "How could you possibly know that by looking at the panel gap?" Catherine asked, her corporate instincts instantly flaring with intense curiosity. Wesley pulled his hand back, slipping it into his canvas pocket. "The hydraulic tolerance is standard for a twin-scroll layout," he said, his voice entirely matter-of-fact. "The Navy used a similar configuration on the cooling systems of the Seahawk transport variants during the late 90s. If you don't calibrate for the radiant heat soak from the block, the metallurgy fails. It's an easy fix if you reroute the secondary line, but factory standard always overlooks the micro-tolerances." Catherine took a slow step backward, her mind racing. She stared at the faded jacket, the grease-stained skin, and the quiet masculinity of the man standing before her. He wasn't just a mechanic fixing standard engines at a local airfield. He was speaking with the fluid, effortless authority of an elite structural aviation engineer, the kind of mind that governments and multi-billion-dollar aerospace firms spent decades trying to recruit. Before she could press him further, the glass double doors at the far end of the showroom shattered inward with a deafening crack. A violent gust of wind tore through the opening, accompanied by the panicked screams of pedestrians outside. The clear autumn morning had vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, violent, localized squall that was common to the mountain valley. But it wasn't the wind that caused the crowd inside the dealership to freeze in absolute terror. Through the swirling dust of the parking lot, a massive, heavy-duty flatbed transport truck carrying steel construction beams had lost its brakes on the steep incline of the avenue. It was hurtling backward, completely out of control, directly toward the fragile glass facade of the showroom floor where Chloe was standing. The screech of tearing metal from the runaway transport truck outside sliced through the air, instantly followed by the shattering roar of the first glass panel on the dealership's perimeter fence. Inside the showroom, absolute chaos erupted. Wealthy patrons dropped their leather briefcases and screamed, scrambling blindly toward the rear exits. Sales associates tripped over display desks, their polished professionalism disintegrating into raw, unadulterated panic. Catherine Sterling froze. The sight of the massive, out-of-control vehicle hurtling backward toward the glass building triggered a violent cascade of memories, the roaring winter wind of Pass 82, the sound of her own vehicle crumpling against stone, the terrifying sensation of complete helplessness. Her hands shook violently, her breath catching in her throat as her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a woman who could command entire boardrooms with a single glance, but face to face with an impending physical disaster, she was completely paralyzed. Wesley, however, did not freeze. The moment the sound of the failing brakes hit his ears, his internal world went perfectly quiet. While the crowd ran and Catherine stood immobilized, Wesley's survival instincts, honed through years of military flight deck emergencies, took complete control of his limbs. He didn't run away from the glass. He ran directly toward his daughter. "Chloe," Wesley shouted, his voice a roaring command that pierced through the ambient panic of the room. The little girl was rooted to the spot, staring out the window at the oncoming grille of the heavy truck. Wesley slid across the slick marble floor, throwing his body forward as he scooped Chloe into his massive arms. He didn't look back to see how close the impact was. He knew by the deep vibration in the floorboards that they had less than 4 seconds. He looked at the Midnight Sapphire SUV display model right beside them. It was a heavy, reinforced prototype built with a thick, protective passenger cell. Wesley yanked the heavy driver's side door open, threw Chloe onto the floorboards beneath the steering column where the frame was strongest, and slammed the door shut with a solid, echoing thud. As he turned to dive for cover himself, he saw Catherine. She was standing completely exposed in the direct path of the oncoming vehicle, her eyes wide and vacant, her hands pressed tightly over her ears as she trembled. Wesley didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the gap, his heavy work boots gripping the slick stone. He wrapped one powerful arm around Catherine's waist and drove his shoulder into her side, tackling her behind a massive, solid structural concrete pillar wrapped in decorative chrome, just as the world outside turned into a nightmare of iron and glass. The impact was deafening. The flatbed truck smashed through the reinforced glass facade with a sound like an exploding bomb. Shards of glass, the size of broadswords, rained down onto the showroom floor, slicing through leather chairs and embedding themselves deep into the walls. The rear of the flatbed slammed into the front display platform, grinding a nearby silver sports car into an unrecognizable heap of crumpled aluminum. The sheer force of the collision shook the foundation of the building. Dust, white drywall powder, and the bitter scent of ruptured radiator fluid filled the air, blinding everyone in the immediate vicinity. The building's automated emergency sirens began to wail, a piercing, rhythmic shriek that added to the disorientation. Wesley kept his body pressed hard against Catherine, shielding her head with his broad shoulders as heavy debris rained down around them. He didn't move a single muscle until the sound of grinding metal finally groaned to a halt. When the dust began to settle, the true danger of the situation revealed itself. The flatbed truck had come to a stop, but its massive cargo of heavy structural steel beams had shifted violently forward. One enormous, multi-ton I-beam had launched off the back of the truck bed and was now wedged precariously into the fractured ceiling framework directly above the Midnight Sapphire SUV. The structural beam was groaning, the internal metal fibers crying out under the immense, unstable weight. It was balanced like a seesaw, tilting lower and lower by the second. Wesley scrambled to his feet, coughing through the thick white dust. His eyes went straight to the SUV. The driver's side door he had slammed shut was now pinned by a secondary piece of crumpled iron from the destroyed sports car. "Daddy!" Chloe's terrified voice echoed from inside the vehicle. The sound was muffled by the reinforced glass, but the panic in her voice was clear. "Daddy! It's dark! The doors won't open!" Wesley rushed to the vehicle, his hands immediately searching for a release. He gripped the electronic door handle, but it remained completely flush and lifeless. The impact had sheared the main electrical conduits running beneath the showroom floor, killing the power to the display vehicle's electronic locks. Because it was a high-end prototype, the manual override was buried deep beneath a locked panel under the front chassis. Catherine crawled out from behind the pillar, her hair disheveled, her charcoal blazer covered in white dust. She looked up at the groaning steel beam hovering like a guillotine above the SUV containing the little girl. The cold, logical CEO was entirely gone. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely push herself up from the floor. "Oh my God," Catherine whispered. her voice trembling as she watched the ceiling frame crack under the weight. The electronic safety mechanisms are dead. The glass is bulletproof. We can't smash it from the outside. Wesley, that beam is going to drop! Wesley looked up at the groaning I-beam. He didn't panic. He stood perfectly still for a single second, calculating the weight distribution, the angle of the tilt, and the exact time left before the structural metal gave way entirely. His face was a mask of absolute, unyielding focus. "Get the remaining staff out of this sector," Wesley said to Catherine, his voice incredibly calm, yet vibrating with an authority that brooked no argument. "Now, Catherine." "But your daughter," Catherine cried, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm going to get her out," Wesley said quietly, looking directly into the dark interior of the SUV where his daughter's face was pressed against the glass. "But I need you to do exactly what I say." Catherine turned toward the perimeter of the showroom, her voice shaking as she signaled her security detail. "Marcus, clear the remaining staff from the north corridor. Evacuate everyone out to the main avenue immediately." Her commands were delivered with her usual authority, but the underlying tremor was impossible to hide. Her hands pressed hard against the concrete pillar to support her weight, her knuckles white. She looked at the massive steel I-beam dangling directly above the vehicle like a suspended pendulum of death, and a wave of pure panic threatened to submerge her. She could run a corporate empire, but she could not stop gravity, and she could not calm the terror threatening to tear through her chest. Wesley did not look up at the groaning ceiling. He understood that watching the danger would not alter its trajectory. Instead, he stepped directly to the driver's side window of the Midnight Sapphire SUV. He leaned close to the thick, reinforced glass, pressing his palms flat against the pane. "Chloe," he said, his voice dropping into a low, incredibly resonant frequency that sliced straight through the wailing sirens. "Look at my eyes, sweet girl. Ignore the noises. Look right at me." Inside the dark cabin, Chloe raised her head from the floorboards. Her face was streaked with tears and white drywall dust, her small shoulders shaking violently. But when her eyes locked onto her father's perfectly calm, steady gaze, her frantic breathing began to slow. The pure, unshakable confidence radiating from Wesley acted like an anchor for the terrified child. "Remember our valley thunderstorm drills?" Wesley asked softly, his lips moving clearly against the glass. "We take a deep breath, and we count backward from 10. Can you do that for me right now?" Chloe swallowed hard, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her yellow knit sweater. She nodded once, her small lips moving as she began the count. Catherine watched the interaction from the shelter of the pillar, a profound, aching realization settling deep within her. She spent her life surrounded by immense wealth, bulletproof security details, and high-priced consultants meant to insulate her from every conceivable threat. She had everything the modern world defined as power. Yet, standing in the ruins of her own flagship facility, she felt entirely naked and emotionally helpless. She could not stop the tears prickling her eyes. She looked at Wesley, a man who possessed nothing more than a bank draft and a worn canvas jacket, yet he was providing an absolute, unbreakable sense of security to his daughter in the middle of a collapsing building. Power could buy luxury, but it could never buy the kind of quiet, masculine strength that kept a child calm in the jaw of disaster. Wesley turned away from the glass, his eyes scanning the immediate debris with analytical precision. "Catherine," he called out, his voice snapping her out of her paralysis. "Look at the wreckage of the sports car behind you, the rear suspension layout sheared upon impact. I need the solid steel sway bar hanging from the lower control arm. Bring it to me." Catherine didn't hesitate. The ruthless billionaire executive dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the sharp fragments of glass tearing into her designer trousers. She scrambled through the white plaster dust, her manicured fingers grasping the heavy, grease-covered iron bar. It was cold and covered in dark lubricants, but she dragged it across the marble floor with every ounce of strength she possessed, handing it to Wesley. Her hands were blackened, her face smudged with soot, the carefully constructed image of the Sterling Empire completely stripped away. Wesley took the bar, giving her a brief, steady nod of appreciation. He instantly dropped to the floor, sliding his broad torso beneath the front bumper assembly of the SUV. Above them, the structural steel I-beam groaned again, tilting another dangerous 3 inches lower. A shower of heavy concrete dust and fractured ceiling tiles rained down onto Wesley's back, but his hands did not vibrate by a single millimeter. "Wesley, Catherine cried out, her voice rising in a desperate panic as she watched the remaining structural cables strain. "The ceiling framework is splitting! You have less than 40 seconds before that entire mass comes down." From beneath the chassis, Wesley's voice emerged, perfectly level, entirely detached from the urgency of the panic surrounding him. Every heavy armored prototype based on the tactical transport blueprints utilizes a secondary mechanical linkage bypass, he explained calmly, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing from the undercarriage. The engineering division retains the manual override behind the front left wheel well liner to ensure extraction capability during a total electrical grid failure on the battlefield. They kept the layout to save on civilian manufacturing redesign costs. He wedged the sheared sway bar deep into the hidden access panel, utilizing the weight of his own shoulder as a counterweight. He applied a precise, rhythmic burst of pressure. A sharp, heavy hydraulic click echoed from the doors. The electronic locking mechanisms cycled manually, the lock pegs on all 4 doors popping upward simultaneously. Wesley slid out from beneath the bumper, coughing slightly through the dust, and immediately rose to his feet. But as he grabbed the driver's side door handle, the metal groaned and refused to budge. A jagged, twisted section of the sports car's reinforced steel frame had wedged itself tightly into the door seam during the initial crash, pinning the panel shut like a heavy industrial weld. Above them, a massive, deafening snap reverberated through the showroom. The primary support cable holding the rear of the multi-ton I-beam sheared completely, whipping through the air and shattering a nearby display pillar. The enormous steel beam dropped instantly, halting just 4 feet above the roof of the SUV, suspended now by a single, fraying braided wire that was unwinding thread by thread. Wesley did not waste time looking at the fraying cable above. He knew the exact rate of failure for braided steel under that amount of dynamic tension. He stepped into the narrow gap between the crumpled sports car and the jammed door of the Midnight Sapphire SUV, his boots crunching on the glass. He jammed the solid iron sway bar deep into the crushed metal seam, utilizing the twisted frame of the sports car as a natural fulcrum. "Chloe, cover your eyes and tuck your knees," Wesley ordered, his voice ringing with a fierce, absolute clarity that demanded total obedience. Inside, the little girl immediately tucked her head down, burying her face into her yellow knit sweater. Wesley planted his boots firmly against the marble floor, wrapping his massive, calloused hands around the iron bar. He threw the entire weight of his upper body against the improvised lever. The muscles across his back strained against the faded canvas of his jacket, his jaw clenching so hard a vein throbbed violently at his temple. The metal groaned, resisting his efforts with a stubborn, terrifying screech. Beside him, Catherine held her breath, her hands pressed against her mouth. She could see the final strands of the overhead cable unraveling, snapping one by one with a sound like pistol shots. With a final, explosive surge of physical strength, Wesley gave a massive heave. The crumpled aluminum of the sports car frame sheared completely with a loud, metallic crack. The SUV door flew open, the hinges screaming. Wesley didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. He reached into the dark cabin, scooped Chloe out from beneath the steering column, and tucked her securely against his chest with his left arm. With his right hand, he grabbed Catherine by the shoulder of her charcoal blazer and violently pulled her backward, throwing his own body over them both as they lunged toward the open space of the rear corridor. An instant later, the final strand of the overhead cable snapped. The multi-ton structural steel I-beam dropped like a guillotine. It slammed directly onto the roof of the Midnight Sapphire SUV with an earth-shattering roar that shook the entire dealership structure. The reinforced safety cell of the premium vehicle held, but the impact flattened the hood and shattered the remaining glass, sending a violent wave of dust and debris blasting outward across the floor. Wesley kept himself positioned as a human shield until the final echoes of the crash died away. Slowly, he raised his head, his face covered in white plaster dust, his eyes completely clear. He looked down at the little girl in his arms. "Are you hurt, Chloe?" he asked quietly, his voice completely steady, checking her arms and legs with a practiced, gentle touch. Chloe opened her eyes, blinking away the dust. She wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck, burying her face into the collar of his work jacket. "No, Daddy. I did the countdown. You got me before I hit 0, Wesley breathed out, a slow, silent release of the immense pressure he had been carrying. He stood up, lifting his daughter effortlessly, and offered his hand to Catherine. The billionaire CEO took his hand, her fingers trembling violently against his rough palm. As he pulled her up, she looked at the flattened wreckage of the showroom and then at the man, who had just saved her life for the second time in a decade. She was completely speechless, her mind racing against the reality of what she had just witnessed. Outside, the wailing of emergency sirens grew deafening as 3 heavy fire rescue vehicles and a military logistics transport pulled onto the shattered driveway. The localized squall had passed, leaving behind a crisp, silent afternoon. A large crowd of onlookers, local journalists, and evacuated personnel had gathered at the perimeter of the broken glass facade, watching the dust clear from the building. A team of heavily equipped first responders smashed through the remaining glass framework, led by a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark command uniform. His name tag read Brody, and his chest was decorated with emergency management and military service ribbons. He carried himself with the strict authority of a veteran commander. Chief Brody scanned the destruction, his eyes looking over the crumpled transport truck and the fallen I-beam. Then, his gaze shifted to the man standing in the center of the ruins, holding a little girl in a yellow sweater. Brody froze. He stopped dead in his tracks, his professional clipboard slipping slightly in his hand. He looked at Wesley's face, the sharp gray eyes, and the distinct scar beneath his left ear. "Commander Vance?" Brody said, his voice carrying over the quieted murmur of the gathering crowd. The title echoed through the ruined showroom. The remaining sales staff, who had been huddled near the back offices, looked up in sudden confusion. Meredith Cole stopped organizing the emergency exit files, her eyes widening. Catherine Sterling shifted her gaze from Brody to Wesley, her heart skipping a beat. Chief Brody stepped forward, his posture instantly shifting into a rigid, deeply respectful stance. He didn't offer a casual handshake, he delivered a crisp, formal salute to the man in the grease-stained canvas jacket. "I didn't know you were in the Silver Ridge sector, sir," Brody said, his voice rich with immense professional reverence. "The department was told you had retired completely to the private airfield." Wesley lowered his arm slightly, giving Brody a brief, respectful nod. "I'm out of the chain of command, Harrison. Just a civilian mechanic now." Catherine stepped into the space between them, her eyes flashing with a mix of awe and burning curiosity. "Chief Brody," she said, her voice reclaiming its executive strength despite the dust on her clothes. "You know this man?" Brody looked at Catherine, his expression completely serious. "Miss Sterling, everyone in the modern strategic aviation sector knows Commander Wesley Vance. He isn't just a mechanic. He was the Chief Master Structural Engineer for the United States Naval Strike Air Warfare Center. He is the man who single-handedly redesigned the survival cell configurations for the entire Atlantic carrier fleet after the multi-aircraft incident in 2014. The crowd outside pressed closer against the barriers, several local reporters leaning forward with microphones. The young man who had been filming the entire incident from the beginning held his phone high, his live stream chat exploding with thousands of comments as the truth began to unravel publicly. Brody turned back to the crowd of stunned sales employees. "If your modern aircraft and premium armored transport vehicles can withstand a structural collapse, it is because Commander Vance wrote the metallurgy and safety tolerance protocols that your engineers copied," Brody stated firmly, his voice echoing out to the street. "He saved hundreds of servicemen without ever taking a public bow. He is a legendary figure in flight safety engineering." Catherine turned her head slowly to look at Wesley. The pieces of the puzzle finally slammed together in her mind with devastating clarity. The man her general manager had tried to throw out of the building like garbage was the very genius whose foundational patents allowed the Sterling Luxury Network to market their vehicles as the safest machines on the planet. She looked at his worn boots, his calloused hands, and his quiet, unyielding expression. The ultimate power reversal had just executed itself in front of her entire staff and the public eye, not through a display of arrogance, but through the undeniable weight of a man's true character. The murmur that rippled through the crowd outside the shattered showroom grew into a heavy, reverent hush. The young man holding the smartphone didn't lower his arm. His screen was flooded with thousands of real-time notifications, a digital wildfire spreading the story of Commander Wesley Vance across the city. The sales associates who had spent the morning ignoring the man in the faded canvas jacket now stood with their heads lowered, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of their collective shame was palpable in the dusty, ruined air. Catherine Sterling stood frozen, her eyes tracking the steady rise and fall of Wesley's chest as he held his daughter. The realization of who he was hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her entire automotive empire, the marketing campaigns celebrating the unyielding safety of her luxury fleet, the very core of her brand's prestige, it was all anchored to the engineering brilliance of the man her company had just tried to discard. Meredith Cole broke the silence, stepping through the debris with a leather folder tightly secured in her hands. Her face was pale from the adrenaline of the crash, but her voice was remarkably clear. "Miss Sterling, the paperwork for the Midnight Sapphire Horizon from the rear holding bay has been finalized," Meredith said, her eyes shifting to Wesley with profound respect. "The manufacturer priority discount has been applied. The total comes to $41,000. Wesley looked at Meredith, then down at the certified bank drafts, still held firmly in his right hand. He separated the necessary drafts, handing them to the consultant with a polite, measured nod. "Thank you, Meredith. I appreciate your professionalism today." Catherine watched him complete the transaction with the same quiet dignity he had possessed when he first walked into the hostile showroom. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology from the trembling staff. He simply paid for his vehicle, his boundaries unshakable. "Let's move to the south delivery bay," Catherine said softly, her voice missing its usual sharp corporate edge. "The air is clearer there. Emergency crews need to secure this structural section." Wesley nodded, carrying Chloe as they followed Catherine through the side corridor. The south delivery bay was a pristine, enclosed area protected by heavy, reinforced concrete walls that had completely escaped the devastation of the main showroom. Inside sat the fresh Midnight Sapphire SUV, its deep paint catching the afternoon light filtering through the side windows. It was flawless, beautiful, and completely untouched by the disaster. Wesley gently set Chloe down onto her feet. The little girl immediately walked to the front bumper, tracing the polished chrome with her tiny fingers. The fear from the collapse had faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder. "Look, Daddy," she whispered. "This one is completely whole. It's ready to go home." Wesley walked over, resting his hand on the hood beside hers, his large frame casting a protective shadow over her small form. He breathed out a slow, heavy breath, the exhaustion of the day finally showing in the faint lines around his eyes. Catherine stood by the entrance of the bay, watching them in silence. Her charcoal blazer was torn at the shoulder, her silk blouse smudged with dark machine grease and white plaster dust, her hair falling loose around her face. For the first time in her career, she looked completely human, stripped of the flawless luxury armor she used to keep the world at a distance. She looked down at her hands, which were still vibrating with a faint, residual tremor. Wesley noticed. He stepped away from the vehicle and walked toward her, his heavy boots echoing softly on the concrete. He stopped a few feet away, his presence grounded and steady, an absolute contrast to the chaotic energy of the morning. "You're still in shock," Wesley said, his deep voice dropping into a comforting, patient register. "Your heart rate is elevated, and your adrenaline is bottoming out. You need to sit down, Catherine." Catherine looked up at him, a sudden, unexpected tightness forming in her throat. She spent every hour of her life being the strongest person in any room, managing crises that involved millions of dollars and thousands of employees. People ran to her for answers. No one ever told her to sit down. No one ever checked to see if she was holding together. "I'm fine," she murmured, automatically trying to reassemble her executive mask. "I've handled market collapses worse than this." "A market collapse doesn't drop a multi-ton steel beam 4 inches from your head," Wesley replied gently, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity that refused to let her hide. "It's okay to let the pressure go. The danger is over." Catherine bit her lower lip, her hands clenching into fists at her sides as she fought back a rare wave of vulnerability. She looked past him at Chloe, who was now sitting happily in the passenger seat of the new SUV, pretending to steer the massive vehicle. "How do you do it?" Catherine asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You lost your wife. You left a legendary career that men would kill for. You spend your days fixing standard engines in a quiet hangar, and when the world collapses around you, you don't even blink. You just keep her safe. I have all the money in the world, Wesley, and today I realized I have absolutely nothing that can buy the kind of peace you carry in your pocket." Wesley looked out the window at the clear blue sky over the valley. The quiet masculinity of his profile was sharp against the afternoon light. "Money buys options, Catherine," Wesley said softly, "but it doesn't buy presence. When Clara got sick, I realized that the Navy could replace a chief engineer in 48 hours. They had dozens of brilliant minds waiting for my rank. But Chloe couldn't replace her father. If I stayed in that world, I would have been a ghost to her, a name on a premium bank account. I chose to be real." I chose to be exactly where she could reach out and touch my hand whenever she was scared. That isn't a sacrifice, that's just being a man. Catherine stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing. She looked at the grease stains on his jacket, feeling a profound, magnetic draw toward the absolute emotional security he radiated without even trying. For a decade, she had carried the guilt of an unpayable debt to a mysterious savior. But standing here in the quiet bay, she realized the debt wasn't a burden anymore. It was an invitation to learn how to live. Chloe rolled down the passenger window, her bright face popping out with a wide, gap-toothed smile that broke the heavy tension in the room. "Hey, sharp lady!" Chloe called out, her voice full of innocent warmth. "Your hair looks like a bird built a nest in it, but I think you look way prettier now than you did in the mean car showroom." A genuine, breathless laugh escaped Catherine's lips, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks as she wiped them away with a stained cuff. She looked at Wesley, their eyes meeting in a long, silent moment of shared understanding that required no additional words. The cold billionaire executive had vanished, and for the first time in 10 years, Catherine felt the first true spark of peace settle behind her breastbone. Wesley gently placed the signed certified bank drafts into Meredith Cole's hands, completing the paperwork on the edge of a clean desk in the South Delivery Bay. The irony of the morning was thick enough to feel, but Wesley carried it with the same quiet detachment that defined his entire life. He had walked into this establishment being told he didn't belong in the presence of luxury, and now he was leaving with the premier vehicle on the lot, having completely transformed the lives of everyone inside it. Catherine Sterling stepped closer to the side of the Midnight Sapphire SUV, her fingers lightly brushing the polished trim. She looked at Wesley, the dust of the collapsed showroom still clinging to her clothes, yet her presence had never felt more genuine. "Wesley," she said, her voice carrying a weight that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the accident. "The Sterling Luxury Network is currently restructuring its entire aerospace and ground fleet development division. Our senior director of structural integrity retired last month. For 4 weeks, my board has been interviewing executives with immaculate resumes and absolutely no understanding of what happens when iron meets a crisis. I want you to head the division." Wesley paused, his gray eyes assessing her through the pale afternoon light. "The job you're describing requires 80-hour weeks and constant international travel to manufacturing hubs, Catherine. I left that life behind because my daughter cannot be raised by a corporate calendar." "I know," Catherine replied immediately, a soft, rare smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Which is why the position has been entirely redesigned for the Silver Ridge headquarters. 3 years ago, I implemented a comprehensive family-first operational mandate across our corporate offices, complete with an elite on-site development academy for children, flexible remote monitoring modules, and a strict no-travel clause for primary caretakers. I built that system because I wanted our engineers to have a life worth protecting. You wouldn't be sacrificing your time with Chloe, Wesley. You would be showing my entire company what true leadership looks like." Chloe poked her head out of the driver's side window of the new SUV, her eyes bright as she looked at her father. "Daddy, does that mean we get to go to the big glass building with the giant fountain outside? The one Mommy said looked like a castle made of water?" Wesley looked down at his daughter, the stubborn cowlick in her hair, the bright blue eyes that carried the living legacy of the woman he had loved and lost. He felt the heavy, protective shell he had built around his heart begin to soften, shifting to accommodate a future that didn't have to be defined solely by survival. He looked back at Catherine. The subtle, unyielding strength in her eyes wasn't a corporate negotiation tactic anymore. It was an unspoken promise of respect. "What's the starting date?" Wesley asked quietly. Catherine's smile reached her eyes, illuminating her face in a way that erased a decade of stress. "Monday morning," she said. "And don't worry about your old truck. My logistics team is going to handle it." 3 months later, the bitter cold of a Silver Ridge February morning melted away beneath a bright, crystal-clear winter sun. Wesley Vance pulled the Midnight Sapphire SUV into the designated executive hangar parking space at the Sterling corporate headquarters. Chloe sat in the back seat, her yellow knit sweater replaced by a thick, warm winter coat, completely focused on explaining why deep sapphire was scientifically proved to be the fastest color in the universe. Wesley listened to every word with the absolute patient devotion of a father who had finally found his footing in a world that had once tried to slide out from beneath him. He dropped her off at the beautiful, sunlit on-site academy, watching through the glass partition as she immediately ran to a painting easel, her laughter echoing through the room. She was safe, she was cherished, and she was exactly where her father could reach her within a 2-minute walk from his desk. Wesley walked through the main corporate lobby, his heavy work boots replaced by clean leather, a tailored dark navy utility blazer sitting comfortably over his broad shoulders. As he passed the engineering bays, younger designers and veteran technicians alike paused their work, bowing their heads in deep, unprompted respect. They didn't see a corporate executive who managed their budgets. They saw Commander Vance, the living legend who had redesigned the survival parameters of modern transportation. He reached the tonelessly, the glass doors of the executive suite sliding open to reveal Catherine standing by the massive panoramic window overlooking the valley. She wore a deep emerald blazer, her dark hair pulled back perfectly, but the cold rigidity she had carried 3 months ago had completely vanished. "Morning, Commander," she said, handing him a warm ceramic mug of tea. It was brewed precisely the way he preferred, the bag left in slightly too long, strong, and dark. "Morning, Catherine," Wesley replied, taking the mug, his rough fingers brushing against hers. A subtle, electric warmth passed between them in the quiet office, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown from a freezing mountain pass to a shattered showroom, and now into something deep, steady, and full of unspoken potential. "Your project specifications for the new emergency response vehicles were approved by the board without a single correction," Catherine said, leaning against the edge of her desk, her gaze lingering on the calm strength of his profile. "They've never seen a design that focuses so heavily on the structural safety of the secondary cabin." "The secondary cabin is where the children sit, Catherine," Wesley said simply, taking a slow sip of the tea. "It's the only part of the machine that actually matters." That evening, the winter dusk settled over the valley in long purple shadows as Wesley drove the SUV back up the ridge road to his quiet home. When he pulled into the gravel driveway, he stopped the engine, his breath catching slightly in his throat. Sitting inside the open garage, beneath the warm glow of the overhead shop lights, was his 1998 dark green Dodge Ram. Catherine's elite restoration team had spent 12 weeks working in absolute secrecy. The faded forest green paint was now deep, rich, and flawless, catching the twilight like a precious stone. The dented tailgate had been straightened by hand, the passenger mirror replaced with original factory chrome, and the heavy-duty engine beneath the hood purred with a smooth, powerful mechanical heartbeat that entirely lacked its old complaint. It was exactly as it had been the day he and Clara had driven it home from the naval base, young and entirely unafraid of the years ahead. Wesley stepped out of the SUV, walking slowly into the garage. He rested his large, calloused hand against the hood of the green truck, the metal beneath his palm feeling incredibly warm, carrying the weight of a decade of memories that no longer felt like a burden. On the driver's seat lay a small, thick white card. Written in Catherine's elegant, unhurried handwriting were 4 simple words: "True strength protects everyone." Wesley folded the card carefully, slipping it into the pocket of his shirt, directly over his heart. He looked up at the vast, star-filled winter sky above the ridge, feeling the presence of Clara in the quiet wind, knowing she was watching the beautiful, ordinary peace that had finally returned to their family. He went inside the warm house, made a real dinner for his daughter, and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the beautiful, endless stories of an 8-year-old child who knew, without a single doubt in her mind, that her father was exactly where he belonged.